that idea that I talked about, but I don't think there's any such thing as non-real. Because the wild thing is, no matter where I look in any wisdom tradition or any religious tradition or science itself, do I find anything that seems to disprove anything else anymore. Like there's all these ways that, somebody thinks they've disproved somebody else, but it's really only at a specific level. And if you move up a level, they're saying the same.
Yeah, it's really a framing and sorting problem, essentially,
Totally.
because you literally can't have information that isn't in some sense true, because everything is formed, all of information is relatively formed to other information. So it's not, you can't like generate a new universe and have ideas from it enter this one. Everything that you say, we've recombined from something else. So it's like almost like structurally, through the very structure of information itself, has to be the case that everything is real. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's all made of real components, basically.
It's made of, the only thing you can do is rearrange, essentially.
Yeah.
So everything is relative, and if your thought is quote unquote wrong, what that really means is the way that you stated it doesn't fit on the frame of the receiver. So you can have a communication failure that's kind of wrong, and you can argue about which frames are more effective communicating with more people, but other than that, like you can't say something that's actually wrong. You can just maybe make it confusing for people to understand you know.
Even intentionally.
Relevance realization is basically like relative to the frame you're interacting with, the other person you're interacting with, or the problem you're interacting with in your own mind, right? There's always something it's relevant to.
So so the way I would talk about an information problem would be that there's a formation that's had in the thinking mind of the model that I hold that does not map onto reality. So would you agree with that? Or are you are you saying something like that, then that map is formed of real things, but they're formulated in such a way as to be misrepresentative?
Yes. Relation.
So you're saying like
all in a relation issue. Yeah.
So you're saying like if I say, I saw a pig fly today, even though I didn't actually see a pig fly, like that's untrue, but at the same time there is flying and there are pigs. They're just combined in a way that's not helpful and not relevant.
Yeah. So you're you're chunking, you're separating, which is what the thinking mind does. You can do that wrong. You can lump things together that shouldn't be, if you're talking about their true nature and their true relationship. But again, if you were at a higher level of reality, you would be clumping those things. So you could basically intersect the layers of reality in a way that is sort of incorrect, but you're doing that with the pieces of this reality. So you're creating a new universe in your mind that doesn't map to this one, because the relationships or the identified elements aren't mapped one-to-one.
But you're not actually creating any elements that aren't there already.
No, you can't. Yeah.
Like in the same way that say the most fantastical dragon is really just an amalgamation of different other characteristics of animals.
Yeah, there's like human fear around snakes and fire and maybe things that fly overhead and steal your food, and you combine them into this like be afraid of nature dragon, and that has a huge purpose. So it gets into like Platonic ideals.
Symbolism stuff comes together.
Symbolism, yeah, because it's symbolism is a way of. Ken always talks about how it's hard to use language to cover a whole frame, many layers of reality from top to bottom, and symbolism comes in because you can represent a lot of detail in ways that are similar across the layers of reality. and you end up being able to express things that have just an incredible density of meaning very compactly.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I don't get what you're saying with regards to this. You can't say anything wrong. Like, or do you mean that you're like, say I lie to you, right? Like the words themselves are wrong, but the intent to create this lie to mislead you is still right. And so what I'm saying is right in something like that. I'm trying to understand what you're saying.
Very close. What I would say is that you can't say something that has no truth in it. You can't have a zero truth statement. You can have something that has, some element of truths, but the parts aren't lined up. Because truth is what is. Truth is where things are. Like where each individual element of the universe is, that's what truth or reality is. But you can't, and because you're a part of that, you're inside of that structure, it's not possible for you to say something that doesn't contain any of those elements. Even if your core point or your main point isn't the most relevant or the most useful for someone else to think of.
Yeah, and maybe there's also a sense in which, like, even at the very worst, you're just proving the null.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
You can say things that are devoid of meaning.
yeah, like if you have a perfect inversion,
Mm-hmm.
right? To say that, I mean, and we might be able to say that this is the idea of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It's to say that I can know is in some sense kind of the perfect inversion, but in and of itself contains within it a truth, which is that I can engage and relate to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it is the absolute inversion of my actual relationship to reality, in order to even tell the lie, I have to, or engage with the lie, I have to still be in relationship to reality. And in so doing, I am speaking something that has a grain of truth inside of it, something like that.
Mm-hmm. I see. So it's like there's a direct line from what you're saying back to truth or something along those lines.
Yeah, like there is, I think maybe what you're trying to say is something like, there is no such thing as fantasy in the way that we think of fantasy in the modern world.
Yeah, that's because I understand your description of fantasy there, being something that you've imagined, something that you've concocted of putting together the parts of different ideas, right?
Yeah.
It gets to like how all different cultures have interpreted all of these wisdom traditions very differently. They're incredibly different, and they seemingly make contradictory statements that, because they're not sharing the same frame. This is actually related to the reference point that you're starting out with, that you talk about, Ken. So if you're on different frames, you can have incompatible answers. And things that seem like contradictions are actually only contradictions, and all paradoxes are this way, because you're not considering enough dimensions. And sort of time, super space time, is the place of framelessness, but inside of space time, you have a frame just by having a perspective, like just looking as I do and having the limb size as I do. Everything that I measure, I do so in relation to me. All of my rulers are certain lengths, and mentally and physically. So I'm not different than the universe. I'm not separate enough from the universe to create something that isn't part of it.
I see. So is you kind of saying that we're bounded by the universe, and so everything that we can generate is also bounded by the universe in a way? It's like it's all real because it's all part of the same whole sort of argument.
Yeah, the sort of short way of saying it is like we are pattern that patterns pattern. So
Interesting.
informationally, you just do what you you rearrange what you take in and your output is the same, operates on the same substrate and with the same elements as what you take in. And there's no part of you that can do anything other than rearrange that. That's why a self is ultimately false in some sense, because it is just a rearranged thing that you made rigid and pretended you didn't do that, you know.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's like if I say the phrase like the self is only the true self when it is not the self, right? Like if you just say that on its own to someone who has no context, it sounds like nonsense. But if you understand a whole background of kind of a Buddhist tradition, it actually is deeply, deeply meaningful of the state of being enlightened.
And
Yeah.
why it sounds like a paradox is because you use self in a way to reference across layers of reality, recursive reference. And recursive references sound like paradoxes. They appear as contradictions until you add the required dimension that shows you the function that operates between those dimensions.
The masterclass on this is that book I just finished, The Being and Nothingness, or Religion and Nothingness, because like the entire book, it's 285 pages of just recursive paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And it's stunning, but it's incredibly difficult to read because you have to jump layer on layer on layer and back and forth